My name's Ed Battistella, and I want to talk about what goes into a good apology and why so many public apologies fail. Recently, my wife and I were having lunch in an outdoor cafe, and there was a little boy throwing stones nearby, and he skipped one of the stones near our table. Well, his mother brought him over and said, "You need to apologize to these people." And he sort of looked down and shuffled his feet and didn't say anything. And she gave him a little nudge on the shoulder and he mumbled, "I'm sorry." And then she said to him, the way your mother's probably said to you at one point, "You need to say what you did wrong and look them in the eye and say you won't do it again." And so he did that. He did a pretty good job on that second try. He showed his embarrassment. He said he was sorry, that he would behave differently in the future. And that's really what goes into a good apology. There are three things. You need to say what you did wrong, basically name the offense. You need to sincerely condemn your actions. And the sociologist Irving Goffman used to talk about this as splitting yourself into two and condemning an earlier self for their bad behavior. And you need to promise to behave differently in the future, right? To talk about what's going to be different. Well, it's pretty easy to tell in person whether someone is giving a good and sincere apology. You can judge their eyes and voice, right? And you can nudge them if they don't do it right. In a public apology, it's a little bit different. A lot of that has to really be carried by the language. So here's an example of a good public apology given by Bill Clinton for the Tuskegee syphilis experiments. Right? And as I'm sure you remember, those were experiments that the U.S. Public Health Service started in the 1930s. They carried on for about 40 years on a community in Tuskegee consisting of largely African-American population, and they didn't tell these 300 men that they had syphilis. Well, when this came out in the 1970s, there were lawsuits, settlements, and so on, but never an apology. Finally, in 1997, President Bill Clinton apologized, and he said this: "The American people are sorry for the loss, for the years of hurt. You did nothing wrong, but you were grievously wronged. I apologize, and I'm sorry this apology took so long in coming." He also reiterated what was wrong, what had been done, and made some promises for future settlements in terms of a Center for Ethics, Medical Ethics at Tuskegee University. So his apology actually captured all of the criteria of a good apology. Well, about a year later, President Clinton had to make a much harder apology and did a much less good job. What he said was basically, "I engaged in conduct that was wrong. I regret that what began as a friendship came to include this conduct, and I take full responsibility for my actions." So if you haven't figured it out, he was talking about the Monica Lewinsky affair. But it's hard to tell from the language. It's very non-specific. He doesn't really come out and say what he's apologizing for. He actually had to make several more apologies along the way and gradually got much better at doing this. One later on said, "What I want the American people to know and what I want Congress to know is that I'm profoundly sorry for all I've done wrong in words and deeds. I never should have misled the country, the Congress, my friends, or my family. Quite simply, I gave in to my shame." A much more sincere, specific apology a bit later. So the language that people use is important. They need to name what they did wrong, but they also need to avoid certain types of language traps, like using conditional ifs or mays or the passive voice. that old bugaboo of your writing teachers. So here's Richard Nixon, having lost the support of the members of his own party, resigning from the presidency. Nixon says, "I deeply regret any injuries that may have been done in the course of events that led to this decision. I would only say that if some of my judgments were wrong, and some were wrong, they were made in what I believed at the time to be the best interest of the nation." Again, you see any injuries that may have been done. I would only say that if some of my judgments were wrong, right? Very non-specific, conditional, passive language. Here's another one that some of you in Oregon may recall. This is former Senator Robert Packwood talking about sexual harassment allegations that were leveled against him in 1992. "If any of my comments or actions have indeed been unwelcomed, or if I have conducted myself in any way that has caused any individual discomfort or embarrassment, for that I am sincerely sorry." If. Right? And here's one more. This is Martha Stewart in 2004. "Today is a shameful day. It is shameful for me, for my family, and for my beloved company and all its employees and partners. What was a small personal matter became over the last 2.5 years an almost fatal circus event of unprecedented proportions, spreading like oil over a vast landscape, even around the world. I have been choked and almost suffocated to death." And a bit later she says, "I'm sorry it has come to this." Well, mixed metaphor aside, is Martha Stewart really apologizing there? Or is she just sorry that something happened? This sort of brings us to another bit of language traps that arise. There are 3 types of expressions you can use to apologize. You can say, "I apologize" for something, to someone. You can say, "I'm sorry." Or you can say, "I regret that such and such happened." Well, saying "I apologize" is the most specific way possible. It's the strongest type of apology. You're actually doing something with the apology. If you just say, "I'm sorry," well, that reports an internal emotional state. It just means that you have sorrow. Maybe an apology is implied, maybe not. And maybe that's what Martha Stewart had in mind. Here's another one from the 1980s. Some of you may remember the Exxon oil spill in 1987. At the time, it was the country's largest oil spill. The Exxon Valdez hit a barrier reef in the bay, and hundreds of thousands of barrels of oil spilled into the Prince Edward Sound. In full-page advertisements in the New York Times and other publications, the CEO of Exxon wrote, "I want to tell you how sorry I am that this accident took place." It was in the context of a larger letter, but listen to the language. "I want to tell you how sorry I am that this accident took place." Why? Is it an apology, or is he just sorry that it took place? And he refers to it as an accident, right? So there's a bit of framing in this apology that made it one of the least effective public apologies of its time. So I'll give you one last example. This is from 2001, when the U.S. reconnaissance planes were flying near China. A Chinese MiG came too close to them. The two collided, bumped. The MiG crashed. The Chinese government was very upset about what they thought were U.S. planes invading their airspace, and it was basically the Bush administration's first foreign policy issue of a new administration, March 2001. Secretary of State Colin Powell went on television, talked about what happened, and said, "We're sorry that that happened, but it can't be seen as an apology." So he actually distinguishes sorry from apology there. So like sorry, regret is ambiguous. Literally, regret refers to one's attitudes. So here's an example from President Eisenhower when the captured spy pilot Francis Gary Powers was sentenced to a 10-year prison sentence in 1960. President Eisenhower's press secretary went on the air releasing a statement that the president deplored the Soviet propaganda associated with the episode and regrets the severity of the sentence. So again, President Eisenhower wasn't apologizing, he was regretting a situation. So as you sort of think about your own apologies, keep those things in mind. What sort of language do you use? Do you say, "I apologize," or do you merely say you're sorry about something, or that you regret that something happened? And if you do apologize, do you apologize if anyone's offended, or for anything that you may have done? If that's the way you apologize, then you're probably not doing a very good job. There's one last thing that works its way into an apology, and that's the job of the person who's being apologized to. The person who's receiving the apology needs to actually close the loop, give some feedback. Is this an adequate apology, or is it not? And when that little boy threw the stones, my wife and I looked at him and said, "Thank you for apologizing, and thank you all for your attention."